Hello and welcome to the MetaStar recorded video introduction to motivational interviewing. This video is intended primarily to be paired with a live workshop learning opportunity. So thinking about the entire span of that, both this video and the live workshop opportunity, our objectives would be that hopefully by the end you will be comfortable identifying the 4 key domains of the spirit of motivational interviewing. We'll also help you think and practice our 4 main skills in motivational interviewing, and hopefully by the end you'll feel comfortable utilizing those 4 skills at least a basic or beginner level. And hopefully by the end, you will feel as though you've been offered an array of MI strategies, and you've identified at least one that you feel like you want to take and incorporate into your day-to-day practice with the people you serve. We'll also spend some time in our face-to-face time thinking about a plan for future development to help continue moving toward greater proficiency in motivational interviewing. What we know from the research about how people best learn motivational interviewing is that small doses are useful, but one workshop or one learning opportunity is never enough to really get you to sustained proficient practice. So we'll help you think about some ways to continue along that path if that feels like something that would be useful to you. If you're just joining this video as a standalone and you're not yet scheduled to attend a live workshop, that's okay. This video will serve as a great introduction to the evidence base for motivational interviewing, so some of the reasons why we say this is an evidence-based practice. And we'll also be getting you introduced to the MI Worldview, or sort of our approach to the people we serve when we're doing motivational interviewing, as well as the spirit or style of motivational interviewing. Just a little bit about me. I've been using motivational interviewing since about 2007, and since about 2009, I've had opportunities to both offer training opportunities as well as coaching to individuals working on learning motivational interviewing. I've worked with folks in a wide variety of settings, also used motivational interviewing with a wide age of people, and I've been lucky enough to have a great deal of varied experience, so hopefully we can connect and think about your particular knowledge and your experience with the people you serve and how that matches up with motivational interviewing. Additionally, I'm a member of the Motivational Interviewing Network of Trainers, which is an international organization of people who are interested in spreading best practices in terms of training motivational interviewing. So before we go too far into anything, we need to make sure we're all operating from a common definition of what motivational interviewing is. Motivational interviewing is a collaborative, person-centered guiding method, and it's specifically designed to elicit and strengthen motivation for change. That is a pretty jargon-filled definition, but it also hits at some of the main important features of motivational interviewing. It is something we do with another person as opposed to someone else. And we really focus on the other person. It sort of occupies that middle space between a very directive method and a very following method. And so in between, that space in between those two things, we call our guiding space. So we aren't just following the other person exactly wherever they want to go. We're offering some structure and some guidance to our interaction. And we're also not just being very directive and telling them exactly what they need to know and do and say. And what we specifically use motivational interviewing for is when there is a particular change or behavior on the table and we have some suspicion that there might be some usefulness to either further drawing out an individual's motivation or helping to bolster and strengthen that motivation that's already been identified. A shorter way of defining motivational interviewing is just a way of structuring our conversations. And our goal is to really help the other person talk themselves into making these changes, which is, a bit of a departure from what we're used to doing in our healthcare conversations, because I think pretty often we're in the position, or we find ourselves in the position where we're making the arguments for the change, as opposed to really concentrating our efforts on helping the other person make their own arguments. So we spoke a little bit already about how it's that middle space between just following and just directing. And motivational interviewing does require a little bit of flexibility to move a little closer to one end or a little closer to the other end of that continuum, just depending on where we are in the conversation and, who's sitting in front of us and what they're bringing to the equation. So there are some sort of two main buckets when we think about what makes up motivational interviewing. There's the technical aspect, and that really is comprised of our skills and our particular strategies. And then there's the relational aspect, and that talks about our way of being, our worldview, our approach to the other person, how we view our role in relation to them and in relation to the change. And there are some things about the techniques and the skills in motivational interviewing that are unique to motivational interviewing, but quite a bit of it might look familiar to you or sound familiar to you from other approaches as well. And the same is true about the relational aspects. But we don't really say that something is motivational interviewing unless we have components of both put together in a particular way. Another way of saying that is that we could just be doing the skills of motivational interviewing in absence of the spirit or the style of motivational interviewing, and it would be like saying the words to a song without the music. It wouldn't really be motivational interviewing. And that is a danger that we see in our initial introductory trainings, is that it's much easier to learn and take on just a skill here or there or a strategy here or there, but without really paying consistent attention to those relational aspects as well, our motivational interviewing attempts often fall flat. When we think about where we can go for a reliable source of information about motivational interviewing, the book pictured here is sort of considered the main book, Motivational Interviewing, Helping People Change. It is written by the two original architects of motivational interviewing, William Miller and Stephen Rolnick. And the first edition of that book was out in '91. We saw a second edition about 10 years later, and in 2013, we saw the third edition get published. In that third edition, over 25,000 articles are included that cite motivational interviewing, and we have the learning from over 200 randomized control trials. There were some significant changes introduced in this third edition, and those come directly out of the latest research and the things we know now about motivational interviewing that maybe we didn't know when it originally emerged on the scene. So for those of you that may have had some previous motivational interviewing learning opportunities, some of the things that we train people on now are a little bit different than the way we had trained them prior to 2013. We say that motivational interviewing is an evidence-based approach. This slide demonstrates pretty nicely a couple of things that we know or that we can say about the research in motivational interviewing. It's a fairly busy slide, but I'll do my best to kind of help guide you through what we can see in looking at this slide. If you look at the first column all the way to the left-hand side of your screen, that represents the first few sort of forays into motivational interviewing. And the first research studies that were published came in that initial time frame of 1988 to 94, and there were 6 of them. If you look at the key for our colors, you'll see that each of those initial studies was in the field of alcohol and other drug treatment. That's where motivational interviewing was originally studied. That's where it first emerged. And then if you look at the next bar on our bar graph, sort of traveling to the right of your screen, in that next time frame of 1995 to 99, we started seeing exponential growth in the number of studies being published around motivational interviewing. And we also start to see quite a bit of variation in the field or population or clinical problem being studied. So in addition to more studies looking at the use of motivational interviewing in the alcohol and drug treatment field, we also see studies emerging that look at dual diagnosis, gambling, offenders, so that's the criminal justice population, eating disorders, treatment, adherence and retention, smoking and tobacco use, HIV, STD risk, cardiac issues, diabetes, et cetera, et cetera. And so, as you can see, very quickly people started saying, the research on this approach is pretty compelling for individuals facing alcohol and other drug concerns. I wonder if it would work with my population, the people I study and the people I work with. And so, as you continue on to the right, looking at the bars, as you can see, the research continued, the quantity of research continued to grow, and we continued to see more exploration into different fields, different clinical populations, different clinical concerns. This particular graph ends at 2009, but if you were to continue, you would see that the bars continued just to get higher and higher. Like I said, we're well over 200 randomized control trials at this point of motivational interviewing, and people continue to identify new areas where they want to study motivational interviewing and where they're thinking about our applications of motivational interviewing. So a lot of research has been done in motivational interviewing. The big question for me out of that is, well, what do we know? Based on the research, what can we say with some reasonable confidence? So we can say that generally we find that motivational interviewing improves retention, adherence, and outcomes across a wide range of behaviors. We also know from the research that motivational interviewing generalizes fairly well across cultures. We also know, and this one is true both for motivational interviewing and a lot of other approaches, we know that relationship matters. And that's true whether we're talking about, the kind of relationship where you might meet with a person for an hour, once a week or once a month on a regularly scheduled basis over a long period of time. That is also true if you have a very brief encounter with someone and maybe you only have one encounter with them. So, one of the places that motivational interviewing has been extensively studied and is implemented extensively is in the context of brief interventions. And so that might be, 7 to 15 to 20 minutes with one visit. And what we know is that the ability of the professional, the practitioner, to connect and to form somewhat of a positive, solid working relationship in that time really impacts outcomes. We also know that change talk, which is kind of defined as the person's own arguments for change, sustain talk, which is the flip side of that, or the person's own arguments for not changing, and discord, so that's what happens if there's disruption in our relationship. All three of those things really matter. They really impact outcomes, and to a large degree, they are in our control as the professional in the interaction. We also know that motivational interviewing is learnable. It's not something that people either are born with an inclination to do or not. We know that people can reliably learn motivational interviewing, acquire the skills, and move toward proficiency. And we also know that there are some tools that very reliably measure proficiency, how well someone's doing at demonstrating the key features of motivational interviewing. And we know that higher measures of proficiency predict better patient outcomes or client outcomes. So, bottom lining it for folks, does MI work? A meta-analysis done in 2010 that looked at, across a wide range of studies in different fields and different approaches, found that about 75% of the time, people who were worked with in an MI way did show improvement. So our short answer would be, yeah, about 75% of the time MI works. Now, of that 75%, about 50% of the improvements that were shown were, statistically significant, but modest improvement. And about 25% of that were robust and striking and still statistically significant improvements. So I like to make sure that people are clear this isn't a magic wand. It's not going to be the thing for 100% of the people you work with. But if you're able to continue to progress your skills to the point where you're demonstrating proficiency in motivational interviewing, which, to be fair, generally takes more than one workshop or exposure to motivational interviewing, but if you're able to get there, the research suggests that about 75% of the time, you're going to see the people you're working with realize some benefits from that effort. So what does motivational interviewing aim to do, right? So at our highest level, we're looking to promote positive behavior change. But what are our more sort of short-term or near-term goals? We work very hard and very strategically to reduce resistance, both by setting up our relationship in a way that's least likely to engender resistance, but also by responding appropriately when it does show up in our encounters. We also directly address and work to resolve ambivalence. And ambivalence is just that experience of feeling two ways. Most people who have not yet successfully made a change have some degree of ambivalence. And you could imagine, ambivalence is like a teeter-totter. And on one side of that teeter-totter, you have your arguments for a change. And on the other side of your teeter-totter, you have your arguments against the change. And both of those are true for you. So what we work to do in motivational interviewing is help people take stock of that equation, and we work to help them add arguments on to the side of the teeter-totter that's going to tip them in the direction of making the change. So an example of that might be someone who is smoking, and they have arguments on one side. They are aware of, the health risks. Maybe they're feeling the impact of their smoking on their health, on their breathing. They're seeing some of the negative outcomes. They might also not like the expense of cigarettes and, not really enjoy the amount of time and money that they spend managing that and making sure they have cigarettes on hand and available to them when they have a craving. And, they might just really want to make a change. They might have some desire on that. And on the other hand, that individual might have some fears or concerns about not being able to successfully quit. Perhaps they've tried to quit in the past and really struggled with it. Often someone considering a change in smoking might have concerns about weight gain. They might have concern about their mood when they're trying to quit. And so they have this teeter-totter situation where they're drawn in both directions. They're pushed and pulled toward and away from the change by those arguments. And so in motivational reviewing, we just work to really address that and hopefully help them find a way to resolve it. In MI, we also really work to raise discrepancy. And so discrepancy is the difference between the way things are in their life and the way they'd like things to be. So we might ask questions specifically that help people take stock of that. And we hold some space for people to really be in that distance and feel that. And there's a bit of discomfort in that space. And as practitioners, as the professionals doing motivational interviewing, we have to work to be comfortable holding the space for that discomfort so that people can spend some time in that discomfort and yet feel safe enough and supported enough that they're able to use that discomfort as motivation to make a positive change. And then another one of our very clear goals and objectives in motivational interviewing is eliciting change talk. Right? So change talk, again, is defined as the other person's own arguments for making a change. So it's not my arguments. It's the other person's own arguments for making a change. And it's important to recognize that there is quite a bit of power in giving people the opportunity to give voice to their own reasons, their own hopes and desires, their own competencies, their own abilities to make changes. And those things all count as change talk, and they all have a positive impact on outcomes. The more someone's able to talk about their change, the more they're convincing themselves to make that change. So when we think about being ready to make a change, we can think about sort of the two components of a change has to feel important enough to someone for them to expend effort on it, and they have to be confident enough to believe that if they spend some effort on that change, they're going to be able to be successful. So sometimes we might see people showing up with high importance but low confidence. Sometimes we might see people showing up with fairly high confidence but low importance. You know, that might be like someone a young person who's smoking. They might not yet have experienced that sort of cycle of becoming addicted to the nicotine, and so they might say, yeah, I could quit at any time, but I just don't want to quit smoking right now. I don't know, maybe down the road it'll be important, but right now it's not really bothering me in any way. Right? So they have low importance. They might have high confidence. So we have to be willing and able to really listen for both elements of that argument. Because if something isn't important enough and people aren't confident enough, they're not going to feel ready to embark on that change. And often what we find is that helping professionals sometimes get ahead of other people's readiness. And so we might start coming up with a plan for someone to make a change or sending them off to a program to help them change before they really feel ready. So we're going to talk a little bit about the worldview and sort of just our general approach that we utilize in motivational interviewing. So our traditional helping professions tend to utilize a deficit approach. That's not to say that they're mean or unhelpful, but we have been trained, right, as health professionals generally to focus on what's wrong. We look at the problem. And so when we are faced with someone who's not making a change that we think it would be beneficial for them to make, we then sort of ask ourselves, well, what's the matter here? Maybe this person doesn't know that they're supposed to make this change. Maybe they don't understand about the change. Maybe, there are gaps in their understanding. Perhaps they don't know how to make the change. Maybe they just don't care about their health. Or perhaps they're sort of in denial about the change or the problem that the behavior is representing. And so when we make some of those assumptions, what we then assume about our role is that we are there to educate people, maybe teach them why that change is important, all the risks that are associated with the behavior. We work to inform them. Maybe we let them know about resources, let them know about how to do certain things. We might try to persuade them to make the change. So we try to come up with really convincing arguments from lots of different angles. Sometimes there's a little bit of sort of guilting people that comes in there. And we just work generally to provide what's missing because we're focusing on what's not there. Unfortunately, the implication and what patients often hear when we're going through this process of trying to sort out what's the matter in that situation is we send the message that there's something the matter with that person. And so that's a very disempowering approach. Our metaphor for that approach is if the glass is, half full, we work to be the faucet and try to fill it up. Right? So we turn our faucet on and pour something into that glass because we want the glass to be full. That comes from a very positive place. It comes from trying to help people. It comes from wanting everyone to leave their time with us with a full glass. Unfortunately, what we find is that doesn't always work. So I don't know about you, but I have certainly been in many situations over the course of my career where I feel like I am gushing and gushing and gushing water, and the cup, no matter what I do, is not filling up. So the change maybe isn't, they're just not accepting that change, they're not willing to make that change. Sometimes in my office, in that moment, they are willing to make the change, but then they come back for a follow-up a week later, a month later, and I have to assume that all the water spilled out somewhere because their glass is right back down to empty. So our challenge with this deficit approach is that it doesn't allow the other person to take ownership of their choices, of their behaviors, of the change, and it doesn't allow them to utilize their own internal resources. It sort of fosters a dependency on us and our resources. So in motivational interviewing, we try to come from it from a different angle. So we try to use what we call a competence approach. And in this approach, we start with what matters to the other person. We want to begin by understanding their perspective, not looking for what's missing, but looking at what's there. So what is this person carrying around? What matters to them? What strengths do they have? What values do they give priority to? What positive experiences have they already had that maybe could transfer some knowledge to this experience? Maybe what's their perspective on the issue? What resources do they already have internally or in their own orbits that they can rely on as opposed to primarily relying on the resources that we have? So then in that approach, we view our role as the helping professional as really to help listen, to aim to understand them, to maybe notice and reflect back some themes that we're seeing, and to ask good questions to get them thinking. And so in our, sort of metaphor here, if they're still the glass and they're not all the way full, as opposed to us being the faucet and trying to pour in what's there, we're working to try and be sort of the straw. So our job or our efforts are directed toward drawing up what's already there maybe focusing it, pointing it in the right direction. Right? Of course, the metaphor only works if you can go with me and imagine it sort of being a self-sucking straw. We've got a futuristic sort of straw, I guess, in our metaphor. But, really thinking about how do we draw up what's there. And I don't know in this glass. Maybe there's just a tiny little bit at the bottom, or maybe the glass is mostly full. But no matter what, we always assume that there's something in there, and there's something in there that is worthy of our effort to draw it up. I like to remind people at this point that it's not, using a competence approach does not mean that you don't get to educate people if there really are deficits in their knowledge. And it doesn't mean that you don't get to link people to resources when there are appropriate resources that could be useful in their instance. But what it means is we're not using the education or the resources as the thing that we hope is going to motivate the change. So first we want to pay attention to what's already there, and we want to make sure that their motivation is intact so that they're fully prepared to receive the education that we're offering, or the information that we're giving them, or the resources that we're connecting them with. So it just helps those things be even that much more effective. Because clearly that is sometimes part of our role. And it wouldn't be ethically responsible of us to withhold those things from other people, but we just don't want to be forcing them on people who aren't yet ready to receive them. So from our worldview, we really hold to a strong belief that people have what they need to make positive changes. People are competent. They know themselves. They have experiences and attitudes and capabilities that they can use in the process of making positive changes. And so our main focus, first and foremost, is on being present with them in a way that's supportive of that change. And that leads us directly into our components of the spirit of motivational interviewing. So initially, we said that motivational interviewing is a collaborative approach, and it is. So we want to utilize partnership. We also want to utilize evocation, or drawing the other person out. We want to work with them in a way that's very accepting of their right to self-determination, their ownership of the change, and the impacts of making a change or not making a change. And we want to do all of that in the context and with a firm grounding in compassion, or doing things in the best interest of the other person. So here is a little image to help you think about what partnership might feel like. So I'm not there in the room with you, but this is a way to bring a bit of myself to you. The image on the right is me dancing with my dad at my wedding. And so we say that we want our experiences, our encounters with other people, to feel like dancing with someone. As opposed to the other image is my son in the purple, wrestling. And so we don't want our experiences, our encounters when we're using motivational interviewing to feel like wrestling. So we say metaphorically, if you just kind of want to get a gut sense in terms of how you're doing with partnership, does it feel like you're dancing with the other person, or does it feel like you're wrestling with them? And thinking about evocation, we really want to be doing a lot more listening and a lot more just letting the other person tell us their perspective and their framework and their understanding versus sort of going in with our set agenda and going down our check boxes of what we want to hear and what we want to say and what we want to do in that interaction. And then acceptance. Acceptance is one of the most important aspects of the spirit of motivational living, and I think it's one of the least understood or hardest, I guess, to operationally understand. Acceptance is really about making sure that you're expanding the person's experience of choice and control in their interaction. Often when someone is faced with a challenging health concern, a challenging behavior, their experience of control in their life is being narrowed. And as a general rule, people don't like to be told what to do. So we often sometimes sort of come to a crash landing at the intersection of, a lot of stuff is going on where people have to take some action and do some things that they might not otherwise do. And we're the professional who sometimes comes in and is telling them what those things might be. And it's easy for us to get kind of off track and for the person to feel like we're the ones coming in, narrowing their choices and telling them what to do. So in motivational living, we really want to work to expand people's experience of the idea that they're in control of their choices and of the change and what, if anything, they decide to do about the situation. And so we have to reinforce that kind of out loud with other people. And it's hard because as health professionals, we often have some knowledge and some foresight that they may not have. We've worked with people over the years who've had poorly controlled diabetes, and we know where that road leads to. We've worked with people who have had cardiac concerns that they've not paid attention and not made lifestyle changes, and we know what might happen in that case. And so it's easy to get into this space where you're sort of telling people what they have to do. And what we know is that that's not a very effective way of partnering with people and working with people that promotes change. So we try to really stay in this space where we're being very accepting and we're communicating that acceptance. And then compassion, which is sort of, as I said, there were some changes that were made in the newest edition of Motivational Living. One of those changes was the explicit naming of compassion as an element, one of the 4 elements of the spirit of motivational interviewing. And the reason why it's now explicitly named is because as recognition has grown about the power in the approach of motivational interviewing, the original architects, as well as sort of the MI community at large, really wants to sort of put our flag in the ground and say, this is developed as something that should be only done to promote the best interest of the other person. So I can't really say it better than the original author said, which is what's here on the slide. And not explicitly named in the spirit of motivational interviewing, but a thread that really consistently connects all of those is empathy. And so empathy is not feeling sorry for someone. It's not pity. And it's not having had the exact same life experience as what the other person is going through. That might be sympathy. But empathy is really our efforts to accurately understand the other person's perspective. And in MI, we also put forth effort to communicate that understanding back to the other person. So it's really about that perspective taking and trying to operate and to motivate that change from within the other person's value proposition, from within their priorities, from within their perspective, as opposed to sort of coming at them with our values and our priorities and our perspective and expecting them to be motivated by that. So as we think about what a motivational interviewing encounter might look like, there are 4 general processes. We always start with engaging, and that is connecting with the other person and developing that positive working relationship. The next element in our, in a motivational interviewing approach would be focusing. So that's where, in partnership with the other person, we determine what is the change under consideration. What are we talking about? And so if you think about some of the health concerns that we work with people on, they involve many complex actual behavior changes. So thinking about, managing your diabetes, right? There's a lot of discrete behaviors involved in that. There's taking your medication, checking your blood sugar levels, making changes to your exercise, or making dietary changes, maybe monitoring your intake of carbs and various sugars, going to all the attendant other visits that we want them to be going to, getting their eyes checked, going to see a podiatrist maybe, other things like that. So all of those behaviors could be an area of focus. And so we want to partner with the other person and figure out, what are we talking about today? And then once you've gotten some focus, then we want to work on evoking. And what we're trying to evoke is that change talk. And then our last step in the 4 processes is planning. And planning is not necessary for it to look like motivational interviewing. We know that generally people who walk out of an encounter with some sort of tangible next action step have better success. And we also know that if we create a plan before the person is ready for a plan, that can push them backwards in terms of motivation. That can sort of frustrate them and have them feeling a little more attached to their reasons not to change. So we have to be intentional about our planning, but that's generally the 4th step, or that 4th process. So those 4 things are generally linear, right? So logically, we would start with engaging and end with planning, and yet they are all interwoven. So even in the planning process, we're still attending to our engaging. We're still working on evoking to some degree. So like I said, we generally start with engaging, and that is where we establish that relational foundation, that positive collaborative working relationship. And it's then proposed that we should think about spending about 20% of our time up front initially with people just on engaging. That doesn't mean, just sort of chit-chat or banter. It really means connecting and making sure that we're listening up front to the other person, that we're working to understand their perspective. Focusing, like I said, is where we develop and maintain a specific agenda. We work to discover what's important to the other person, and often this is an unfolding and evolving process. It may be that we focus on something, get some resolution, and then refocus on something else. That is very dependent on, what you're actually working with the person on, because it may look different if I, work somewhere where right over the door it says smoking cessation clinic. Generally, it's pretty safe to assume that the people walking in that door are coming to me because they want to quit smoking, and so that's going to be what we're talking about. Versus if I'm, sort of a health educator and I work with people on a wide array of various behaviors. And then evoking, and like I said, what we're working on in evoking is evoking that change talk, and that's where we particularly utilize a large number of our strategies that we will talk about in more depth. We don't have time to go over what those strategies are on this video, but we will in the future. think about what are some of the strategies that we can utilize to really draw out the other person's change talk. Sometimes it just shows up naturally, but a lot of times we have to really intentionally and deliberately go after it and create good opportunities for it to show up in our encounters. And then, like I said, planning is generally our last step, not necessary to have it happen for it to look like motivational interviewing, but generally it is the last step in the process. If we get to it, if the person's ready, we still want to maintain our motivational interviewing approach when we're working on planning. So at this point, we've come to the end. Hopefully, over the course of this video, you've gotten a little bit more familiar with some of the evidence base for motivational interviewing, some of the research and what it tells us. Also, hopefully we've helped you get a little bit more of a start of an understanding of the worldview and the approach that we utilize in motivational interviewing, as well as the four main components of the spirit of motivational interviewing: partnership, evocation, acceptance, and compassion. We briefly touched on the four processes in motivational interviewing, and what we did not cover on this video is anything in particular about our skill set in motivational interviewing or our particular strategies in motivational interviewing. If you're viewing this video as an introduction to get you ready for a live workshop, this will give us the opportunity to really hit the ground running with some of those more technical aspects of our motivational interviewing when we have our face-to-face workshop time. If you're viewing this as a standalone, please just know this was an introduction and a small taste of motivational interviewing, and in order to do it, you're going to have to seek out some opportunities to develop some skills and utilize some of the MI skills and strategies from within the spirit and the worldview of motivational interviewing. So my contact information is listed there. If you have questions, please feel free to contact me if you'd like more particulars about any of that. We covered quite a bit sort of in a medium depth way, but if you want to do a deep dive on any of that, let me know. And thank you for your time, and thank you for spending a little bit of your really valuable time thinking and learning and getting introduced to motivational interviewing.